As we continue with Taste of Messiah, we come to today's taste, which is the true Mashiach would be the final sacrifice for sin. Now, this idea of the Mashiach dying as a sacrifice for sin is a very difficult fact to accept by many Jewish people. They have always expected that the Mashiach would be a conquering king, making Israel the supreme nation. And that will happen. However, what many Jewish people miss is that the Mashiach would first come as a humble servant who would die for the sins of the world. Now, as the Spirit is the Father, could not shed his own blood because he indeed is Spirit, so he embodied the Son of God in human flesh, and God then could sacrifice his own life, which he actually prefigured in the story of Abraham, which is we've talked about in earlier tastes, is the Akedah. And so Abraham was instructed by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. And we see this in Genesis chapter 22, verse 7. But Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, "My father." And Abraham said to him, "Here I am, my son." Then Isaac said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So the two of them went together. The key here is that God will provide himself the lamb. This idea of God's sacrifice is alluded to later in Leviticus as Israel is becoming a nation. In Leviticus chapter 17 and verse 11, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul." It is very simple how God here says he gives the blood on the altar. We see this also much more clearly in the book of John, chapter 3, verse 16, which is without a doubt the most popular and important verse used by followers of Yeshua. For John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." This verse is demonstrated in Isaiah 53:1, where it says, "Who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" So already here in the beginning of this chapter, we see that there are going to be people who don't believe it. And then it goes on in verse 2, "For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form or comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him." So we understand here that the Mashiach there would be nothing special about his outward appearance. He would be just like any other ordinary man. It goes on in verse 3, "He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him." So even though he was doing all this for us, it was hard for people to accept it, and it still is. In verse 4, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted." So indeed, the Mashiach would be one that would actually carry people's sorrows and carry their griefs, along, of course, with their transgressions, as it tells us in verse 5. "But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed." So literally, the stripes would be the wounds that Yeshua received on his back. It's amazing. This is such an incredible picture of the crucifixion of Yeshua and the reason for it and how it actually looked. It goes on in verse 6 to say, "All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." And indeed, it's the way every one of us are. We all tend to do exactly what we want to do. We want to go by what we want. We are basically the rulers of our own life. It wasn't meant to be that way. We were meant to be governed by our Father. In verse 7, he says, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. And we know in the accounts in the gospel that when Yeshua was being accused and had all these mock trials, that he didn't open his mouth. He never gave a defense for anything that he had done. In verse 8, he was taken from prison and from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. So you see, my people, of course, are the Jewish people, Israel. And that's why he was, first of all, cut off. And that's why he was crucified, for the transgression of Israel. And then, of course, for the sins of the whole world, as it says in John 3:16. Going into verse 9, and they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he was done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. And we know the account is very plain that Yeshua didn't have a grave of his own, but a rich man, Joseph, would actually allow Yeshua to use his grave, and he would be buried in a rich man's grave. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. And there it is again. He's showing that he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he has poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And he bore the sin of many, and many made the intercession for the transgressors. Even though most Jewish people don't realize that Yeshua is the Messiah, they soon will. And we have the proof of this from the Tanakh in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. And I will pour on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. Then they will look on me, whom they pierced. Yes, they will mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn. Do you see the wounds Yeshua received in your place? Are you ready to cry out, He is your Lord?